Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Charity Digital webinar. I'm your host for today, Zoe. I'm a new host on the Charity Digital scene. You may have received emails from me in the past, probably relating to webinars and events and things like that. But this is my first kind of hosting. I don't know what the word is, hosting opportunity. So yeah, be kind to me. I'm marketing executive here, and as I said, I market a lot of our events and our webinars I used to as well. So you might have heard from me in the past, but that's enough about me. On to today's webinar. So we're here to talk to you today about the Charity Digital Skills Report from this year. We've got our fantastic speaker, Zoe Amar, here to give you all the knowledge and wisdom on the report. And just a quick note on today's webinar that it is going to be an interactive one. So we will be using the chat. Zoe will be asking you questions in the chat. Obviously, you don't have to participate, but you will get the most out of the webinar if you do. So we do encourage you to answer the questions and participate in the kind of interactive tasks that Zoe's got throughout. And I know that I'm also called Zoe and Zoe's called Zoe, so don't get too confused between us. We've got two Zoes in the house today. So maybe it would be good to kind of test out the chat a little bit. It'd be good to know where you're all joining from today, you know, what the weather's like, what you're having for lunch. I'm joining from the bright lights of southwest London, so very glamorous from my nice bedroom, bookshelf over there. So yeah, that's me. If anybody else wants to share where they're joining from, that would be lovely. Oh, Helen from Bedford, hi. Skies are grey, literally every day in London, or just in the UK. Oh look, yeah, now everyone's coming in. Okay, well I can't read all of them, but it is very nice to see where you're all from. Central London as well, yeah. Herefordshire, lovely. Wiltshire, well, that's very nice. Cardiff, never been there, but heard great things. Okay, so now on to introducing Zoe, our speaker for today. So we've got Zoe Amar with us today, and I'm sure you have all heard of her before, but she runs Zoe Amar Digital and co-author of the Charity Digital Skills Report, and she's also a trustee of Charity Digital, which is lovely. So I'm going to hand over to Zoe to kind of take over the webinar, and I will be back at the end for the Q&A. So yes, Zoe, over to you.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to see you all here today, albeit virtually, and great to see so many of you dialing in from all over the UK, and also I think I spotted someone dialing in from Port Elizabeth in South Africa. Very exciting. I have to say I'm slightly jealous of whoever has sunshine today. I myself am sat here in St Albans in Hertfordshire. I did notice someone had dialed in from Bedford. Hello to you. And it's rather grey here today, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that I can liven up your Thursday with some stats about use of digital across the charity sector. So what we're going to be doing as part of this webinar is I will be talking through some of the key findings from the report, but giving you some time to think through what they've been for you. So what we have done here is we've taken key findings from the report itself and then diced them up a bit, included some questions on various different themes. So periodically throughout the webinar, I'll be getting you to think about what some of these findings mean for you and also what you can do about them. And in that sense, I hope that the deck that we send out afterwards will also be a useful resource for you to take back to your organisation too, and to get everyone thinking about where you're at with digital and where we go next. And we know that lots of organisations have made significant progress with digital over the last 18 months. So I'm very excited to hear from all of you today about where you've got to and also where you are thinking of going with digital in your future strategies. Right, so I'm going to share my screen and then we will get this on the road. So hopefully you can all see that okay. As we go through this session, as I mentioned, there are going to be a few questions for you guys. Please do pop things in the chat. As you all know, if you ever screen shared and presented at the same time, generally speaking, I should be able to see the chat, but there may be times when I miss things in the chat. So Zoe and Sasha, if you spot anything which I've missed, please do shout, but I will endeavour to do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well. Generally speaking, I should be able to see it. Right, so let's talk about what we're going to be covering in this session. So as I mentioned, we'll do a bit of a deep dive. We'll look into what do the findings mean for you, and then we've also got some time at the end, as I mentioned, for Q&A. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you all further as part of that. Right, so firstly, if you haven't come across the Charity Digital Skills Report before, I just want to take a minute to explain a little bit more about what it is and why we do it. So essentially, it's an annual barometer of where the charity sector is at with digital. It began life as a report that very much focused on skills, but it's also a report that focuses on attitudes and support needs and some of the key critical factors that influence digital. So, for example, things like leadership, resourcing, IT. As we all know, digital is a bit of a golden thread that runs through every organisation, whether they're a charity or not. So what we're trying to do, and the report is in its 5th year now, is to really build a picture of how use of digital is changing across the sector. So I suppose in a sense, skills is a bit of a proxy for that. So in terms of who responded this year, and if you responded to the report, thank you. We are very grateful to everyone who did so. What we did in terms of the report itself is we were lucky to have 365 responses this year. For the very first time, we found that the predominant group responding were actually from CEOs or leadership and digital roles. So that was really interesting because we haven't had that many people previously in percentage terms who were at that level of seniority. So that was really interesting. And we were also pleased to see that we had more responses from charities and smaller organisations. So that was really heartening to see as well. So I want to keep all of this coming in the 2022 report. Let's dive into some key findings now and talk a little bit more about where you are at in relation to them. So first up, I'm going to talk through the impact of COVID on use of digital across the sector. And then I've got a question for you guys, and I'm interested to hear where you are at with this stuff. So you might have seen that there have been some real changes to services in response to demand. I think a lot of people have experienced that on the ground, and the report itself has really borne that out, as you can see from the data here, and a lot of innovation as well. So charities using digital to reach new audiences in significant numbers, as you can see here. Of course, there are some barriers and challenges. So as you can see, even some charities themselves have struggled with basic tech access. And there's also the challenge around the demands of very intense remote working as well. I personally am very pro remote working. My organisation is remote first, but I think we all know the strain of being on back-to-back video calls and some of the really full-on ways we've all been working over the last year. So you can see here there's a pretty significant risk of burnout across the sector, and that is something which I think we really need to take action on in our organisations. Moving on to digital inclusion, and you'll have seen this is again popping up in the press today with a number of different stories that have come up. This was the biggest barrier to moving forward with digital this year. So half of the charities we spoke to said that they were worried about excluding some people or groups. And also there were some worries about a chunk of people in the audience, say 24%, not being online. And that's led to cancelling some services as well, whether it's because the people who charities are trying to reach don't have the skills, or whether the charities themselves don't have the tech or the skills. So I think what these findings show around inclusion is that it's a very complex picture, and there's a lot of different factors to take in, both on the side of the charity and also the people who the charities are trying to reach to. And then briefly, just on future of work, because I know a lot of people are talking about the impact of the pandemic. As you can see here, a really significant number of charities are planning a blended way of working, spending some time in the office, some time working remotely, but interesting to see some data on that, so we're pleased to get that. And as you can see as well, more organisations, more people are placing a priority on working for an organisation where digital is a real priority, and where investing in staff skills and capabilities is something that's very important to the organisation. And I think this is going to be a key factor as charity professionals think about, well, if I'm moving job, where am I going to go to? Will it be to an organisation that is really making the commitment to growing digital skills a priority, or perhaps would I work for an organisation that's not doing that? So I think that is a really important part of how we help the workforce stay motivated and how we make sure that everyone can come on the digital journey too. So those are 3 key findings about the impact of the pandemic on how charities are using digital. I have a question for you now, in fact, a couple of questions, and I'd love it if you could put your answers in the chat. And you can answer one of these or both of these, whatever you have time to do. But what I'd like to hear about is, how has your charity's use of digital changed this year? And if you feel happy to answer it, what is your charity doing about burnout? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that, get some answers down in the chat, and then we will see where you're at before moving on to the next finding. So off you go. Lovely, lots of really good responses here. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at those, but I'm just going to briefly pick a couple out, if I may, because I think there's some great stuff here. Helen says that their one-to-one volunteer recruitment sessions now take place on Zoom. And I think this is really interesting because it's where there's an efficiency for the charity, but also for the volunteer as well. And what I've heard from some organisations is that actually that's helping make it easier to recruit volunteers and onboard them, because it can be done very conveniently. So really interesting to hear that example. Thank you, Helen. I will just pick a few things more. Louise, this is really interesting about having a combined recruitment and digital budget, and that enables collaborative working around digital. That sounds fascinating. I'm sure lots of people would love to hear more about that. So if you have a chance to share anything else about it in the chat, that would be really interesting. Because obviously budgets for digital and how you attribute them and where they sit, who signs off, is always a real hot topic in a lot of organisations. What else have we got here? Eve says, this sounds great, Eve. You launched a whole new range of digital art workshops, and you're continuing to embed digital from the beginning of projects now. Amazing, really, really good. Pleased to hear that. Interesting about burnout as well, hasn't been discussed in your organisation. I think a lot of organisations are at different stages with this stuff. Some people are doing a lot of wellbeing initiatives, some people aren't perhaps quite there yet. It may be that your staff are in a good place. In other organisations, perhaps the demands have been particularly intense on them. Everyone's at a varying point on this. And I did notice that oh, really good from Madeline, really interesting. You've identified a risk of burnout, so implemented team wellbeing walks and virtual coffee meetups. It's so important, isn't it, to think about how we can use these new ways of working to make sure we've still got that time together and to have some agenda-free interactions as well. So that sounds really great, lovely. Excellent. Right, so many good contributions there. Please do continue to have a good look through those. I'm sure there'll be plenty of very good comments as we go through this. I'm going to move on now, and we will have a think about strategy, because this is a stat which always gets a lot of interest every time we run the report. And some of you might remember that in the previous years we've run the report, this has actually stayed fairly static right since 2017. But excitingly, this has actually gone up this year. So I was very pleased to see that. So as you can see here, 60% of charities now have a strategy in place for digital. And just to clarify in terms of what that means, that could be digital having a real front and center role in your organizational strategy. It could be a standalone digital strategy. It might be a one-pager. It might be a real full-on document. I don't really mind at all what it is, as long as someone somewhere in your organization has done the thinking about where you're going with digital, what you're going to do to get there, and also what you're not going to do on the way, and that has been communicated and bought into. So certainly I'm quite agnostic about the vehicle, but I'm so pleased to see that this stat has actually moved forward. More charities are thinking about this stuff in a strategic way. Hooray, fantastic. And we can see here that there's some really good commitments to how people are going to use digital moving forward. So more are planning to invest in digital skills, and then there's a greater sense of charities committing to digital service delivery. So this hasn't been a flash in the pan during the pandemic, which is good to see. It's something which a lot of people are continuing to focus on as they deliver what they do. So that was brilliant. Really, really pleased to see that. And then in terms of priorities for the next year, because I think it's always really interesting to see what charities are planning to do in the next phase of their development, particularly when we're thinking about it through the lens of the road to recovery. Channels, once again, was the absolute top priority. And that has actually been very similar even before the pandemic as well. So we can see here some of these key critical factors of being able to improve your website, your online presence, social media. I guess this is such an important thing for our sector because it directly leads to fundraising and campaigning and awareness and community building and all that good stuff that you all do. This is something which is still really, really important to charities. So please do continue to take a look at what Charity Digital are doing in terms of their content, because I know that they provide a lot of really good advice about this. So my question for you guys is about how you would define your strategy. Even if you don't have a formal strategy, as we were saying earlier, you might have done some thinking about it. Do just pop down any thoughts on how you define it in the chat, and if you can include in that, where you're trying to go with digital and how you're planning to achieve it, which is pretty much the same thing as your strategy, that would be wonderful. So I will give you a couple of minutes, get down as many ideas as you can, and then we will see where you're all at. So off you go. Great, so some fantastic comments coming in. I'm just going to pull out a few of them. Really, really good stuff here, guys. Thank you. Please do keep them coming in. David says they've got a digital transformation program that's covering a lot of different areas, whether that's the website, whether that's the CRM, and also how that integrates with your engagement strategy. That is great to see, because I think one of the challenges at this time as organizations ramp up their use of digital data and technology further is that if you've got a significant volume of activity, things can end up developing in a silo. So David, brilliant to hear that that is all integrating with your engagement. You want the front facing and then the kind of inwards facing, all of that stuff working together in tandem. So that is fantastic, great stuff. Kerry has a digital everywhere working group looking at how they can innovate at one end of the spectrum, but also consolidate strong services at the other. So this sounds fascinating, Kerry, because it seems like you're taking a really holistic look at digital there, and thinking about how you can balance some of perhaps the BAU. So it sounds like you obviously have been running some digital services during the pandemic, I would surmise from that. And then also thinking about how you develop new products and services. And I'm going to say a bit more about digital products and services later on in this presentation. So that sounds great. I'm intrigued to hear more about this digital everywhere group. It sounds really, really good. What else have we got here? So we can see from Maruf, hope I'm saying that right. about implementing digital strategy across these different areas. That's great, really good. As we were saying previously, looking at how you can implement this stuff in all different parts of the organisation where it's happening, taking a joined up approach, making sure that there's someone who's got oversight of everything that's going on. That's really great. So I'm very pleased to see that. Laura's got a really good point about how there's now an increased emphasis on engagement and the donor journey. And I think what's been so fascinating over the last 18 months is seeing how the conversation for a lot of organisations around digital and in particular fundraising has really changed, and people are putting more emphasis on things they might not have done before the pandemic. So that's also really exciting as well. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, Sally, you had a great point about digital champions, which I saw earlier when I was having a look through a few moments ago. And I think this is a really good one, because you're right. If you don't think about the culture side of things and also what is happening at perhaps that mid-level to grassroots level of the organisation, whatever size you are, I think your level of engagement with digital internally is only going to get to a certain point. So you're right, having these key people amongst the staff or the volunteers who can champion digital, who can share what they do with other staff members, that is really vital for creating some energy around these changes. And you do need that momentum and that motivation for people to keep moving forward with digital. And the confidence thing is so important. I'm really, really pleased you phrased that, because what I sometimes see in organisations is that you go and the level of digital skills is actually not that bad. It's just that people aren't clear on what they're empowered to do, what they can do in a work context, what skills they're allowed to share, and also, can I come up with this idea about the new digital fundraising campaign I've been thinking of? Is it okay to share that? Are people going to think it's a bit of a wild idea? But actually, I think this is part of the confidence piece as well. So people are clear on what skills they have, what kind of stage they're at, what they need to do to close the gap, and also how they can use those skills in the workplace as well. And I expect that will become even more of a focus with the hybrid working models that we're all moving into. Lovely. So many great ideas here. Thank you so much to everyone for sharing those. Let's move on now, and we can begin to think about skills a little bit more. So I'm going to start here, to Pauline's point, looking at leadership teams and boards before we dive further into what's going on in the rest of the organisations. And I think one of the big things that we've all seen over the last year, and perhaps before as well, is that if you can get your CEO and your board to see digital as a priority and to commit to it and to invest in it, then obviously moving forward with digital is inevitably so much easier. However, there are some key points here which came up yet again in this year's report. So you can see here that only 1 in 5, so 20%, say that the skills are low amongst their trustees, which is some progress, but there's obviously still some way to go as well. If you look at that full picture, so 38% saying there is room for improvement. And I think that we all need to consider how we can make sure that digital skills is a real priority as we look to recruit new trustees. And if you're looking for information about that, Reach Volunteering have some really, really good stuff on their site, so I would recommend that. And obviously there is a knock-on impact if boards are not skilled up in that area. So you can see here that's made, unfortunately, a bit of a difference here in the number of boards who are actually providing buy-in and support for digital. If you think about that volume of digital activity across the sector during the pandemic versus the amount of boards here who are actually providing buy-in and support, there's a real disparity. And we want to make sure that the boards and the organisations obviously moving in closely together in this stuff. Otherwise, you're going to get this real imbalance in where you can go next with digital. And one of the biggest challenges was that charities wanted their CEO and board to provide a really clear vision of what digital would help them achieve. And I do think this is an important part of the road to recovery. It's one thing to do digital, but as we've all seen today, it's very much about how can we do digital with a clear purpose. And the pandemic has provided a real urgency around that. How is that story going to develop and change on the road to recovery? So that's where leadership teams and boards are as well. And you can see that we've got people leading on digital as well. So it's good to see that. It'd be interesting to see how that develops next year in the 2022 report. Let's dive in now to some of those digital skills that are in the rest of the organisation. So it was interesting here to see some of the skills gaps that charities have. Firstly, there's been some good progress around basic digital skills, and those charities rating themselves as excellent. Really good, delighted to see that. Still some quite significant gaps around things like digital fundraising, user research, that comes up again later. I'll tell you more about that further on, and making the most of their channels as well. And I think some of these skills gaps really point to the other issues that were highlighted earlier around doing more with channels and understanding the insights that come from them as well. And I think that's borne out with the point here about data. And charities clearly have some very good ambitions for what they would do, increasing digital skills. So whether it's getting more from data, growing your reach, delivering strategy more effectively, there's some really good solid aims here. And I think what this shows is that these three things are perhaps some useful points to consider when you're trying to make the case to senior people in your organisation for how investing in digital is going to help you in this next phase of the pandemic. So now that we have looked at leadership skills, we've also looked at broader skills across the organisation. I have a question for you. In fact, two questions. So firstly, I'd love to hear how you would describe your CEO and board's digital skills. So do pop that in the chat. And then if you have time, it would also be really interesting to hear what you think are the digital skills that you need to develop in your organisation for the road to recovery and why you think they are important. So once again, I'll give you a couple of minutes, pop your thoughts in the chat, and then we will see where you're at. So off you go. Lovely, so much good stuff here. Goodness, now I wish I could go through all of these. I'm just going to pick out a few, and hopefully that will help you get a sense of where everyone's at. There's definitely a real overlap in terms of the themes here. It feels like there's some stuff here, and before I look at the individual responses, perhaps around some boards not having that level of awareness in the digital skills gap that they have. And one way I have seen some boards tackle this is around doing a digital skills audit. And obviously boards do periodically have skills audits, or they should. So that might be something to factor into that. But I think what is always a really interesting one to consider, because I can see there's a real appetite in a lot of these comments to grow digital skills amongst the board, is around how you create that urgency to do it. Because having sat on quite a few boards myself, they can be quite a protected environment to a certain extent, and because you are not, by the very nature of your role, part of the wider organisation, you don't have a line manager obviously saying to you, look, come on, you need to develop your skills in this area because it's going to help you do this. So actually there's a really critical role here for the chair. So a couple of things I wanted to suggest on this before I come back to the individual comments is, first, you need to look at how you can create that burning platform. And one thing to do is to look at how other similar organisations are using digital. So perhaps if you're a youth mental health charity, for example, if you can show your board some examples of, say, another youth mental health charity running a brilliant digital fundraising campaign, or creating some award-winning digital services, just something that raises the bar for them. So they begin to realise that where we're at right now could actually be better, and we need to invest, we need to get behind this stuff in order to make it happen. So that's one thing you can do, appeal to their natural, healthy sense of competition. That can be a really good thing. And then another thing that you can do as well is to start to kind of define the cost of not doing it internally as well. So there's a small charity that we were talking to a little while ago where they looked at the amount of time it was taking up for stuff when they were just doing stuff manually and using some pretty old inefficient systems, and they were able to map that in one team and show that actually if they could get these systems up and running, they could train staff in using them, then they would be able to save a significant amount of staff time. I think it was like 1 day a week or something along those lines. So I think the more you can kind of quantify not doing this, and the more you can show how other organisations are not doing it, I think you have to give boards something really tangible that's clearly part of the business case. So I just want to come back briefly to a couple of these points because they are really, really good. Really like them. Stephanie, you've got a great point here about the ability to make data and evidence-based decisions rather than subjective ones based on opinions. I think that is such a good point. And I think some boards may need guiding on what that actually looks like. Occasionally I work with boards where they think in order to make data-driven decisions, they need to be real experts in digital data. But actually some of those kind of business questions, as it were, about is this value for money, what's the total cost of ownership, things like that, they can be really good ways into this topic. So what I'd recommend, actually have a look at the managing risk principle in the Charity Digital Code of Practice, because that's got some useful conversation starters there to get boards thinking in a bit more of a digital way. Just going to briefly look a couple of other comments, really interesting. A couple of people reporting that their CEOs have some way to go in developing their digital skills. Jenny, you've got a really good point about obligations around data and information. Again, I would have a look at the Digital Code of Practice. There's some stuff in there that hopefully you would find helpful, because you're right, this is a governance issue, absolutely. And then also, what else have we got here? Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Lucy, very good point about people perhaps not being so aware. So I think that comes back to the suggestions that I made earlier about how can you help them develop that awareness of where they're at with digital, and then the impact that that has on the charity too. Excellent. Right, so many good points. So please do take a moment to look at them if you haven't already. I can see a lot of you in very similar positions. There's a lot we all need to do together to grow these digital skills across the sector. And speaking of which, I'm going to share with you my final finding, and then we will talk about where you are at with it before we move on to some Q&A in a few minutes' time. So obviously, really key thing that's been happening across the sector during the pandemic is lots of organisations developing, launching, switching existing offline services over onto digital. But we need to make sure that we have got the skills in place across the sector so that we can fulfil our commitment, our intention that we've got in this report to keep offering really good online services. And obviously the core of offering good online services and developing good digital products and tools is understanding what your users need. And we can see here that this is a real skills gap across the sector, which frankly is something which is going to be a concern to all of us. So we can see here as well that some people are also concerned about accessibility of their products and services, and also the factors around that, such as diversity of decision making, perhaps having some dependency on key platforms. Having dependency on platforms is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but obviously there can be some potential risks there if you realise that you've got a really significant dependency on one platform. What happens if one of those goes down and there's some business continuity issues and all those sorts of things. So it's good to see charities beginning to think about these issues, absolutely. But yeah, we can see here that this is an area where charities definitely need some support. And where I would signpost people to is, I think Catalyst and CAST are doing some fantastic work supporting the sector in developing their confidence, their skills with digital products and services. So do have a look at things like their service recipes on the Catalyst site, which has got some really helpful guidance. And also they do periodically run their design hop, which I think they're doing online, and they've been doing that throughout the pandemic, which will take you through the key principles of how you develop digital products and services. So that's also something to look at as well. Right, so final question for you guys before we move into the Q&A in the final 15 minutes of this session. What I'm really interested to hear about is how you are getting an understanding of what your users need, how you're factoring those into the development of your digital services. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, get some ideas down, pop them in the chat, and then we'll see where you at. So off you go. Lovely, thanks everyone. These responses are absolutely fascinating because they show the different stages that people are at with understanding this stuff across the sector. And I think that's absolutely fine. And also, I hope what's useful about sessions like this is the opportunity for people to learn from each other as well. So what I've seen here amongst the comments before I dive into some individual examples, everyone from people who've got teams of service designers and UX people, right through to people who are at the stage of perhaps doing surveys and some focus groups. And all of those different approaches are fine and valid, and all of them have their own merits. So absolutely, I think you've got to kind of cut the cloth with this stuff based on what resources you have, what people you have, what time you have. But hopefully there's some underlying principles we can dive into a little bit more here, which provide the foundation for how you do this well, however you then choose it. So one comment that really came to mind I thought was really interesting. Eve, you've got a great suggestion here. A lot of your digital audience are families, they've got limited free time. So trying to make sure that any digital content is available on demand and pre-recorded. And actually, sometimes I think in digital products and services, if you can identify a really simple, really clear user need like that, it's a small thing to do, but it can be incredibly powerful and really make a difference to people. And the reason why that also caught my eye, Eve, is that if your charity is working in an area where digital inclusion is a real issue, and I know a lot of pretty much everyone across the sector knows that that's a factor for what they're doing, depending on your audience. There's a really great report that I'd recommend you look at, came out today from a young people's charity called Kids, where they have specifically looked at the impact of digital inclusion on the disabled young people and families that they have been supporting during the pandemic. And why Eve's comment made me particularly think of that is that one of the things they have found very useful in terms of the digital services they offer is to make sure that they use the phone alongside offering services on Zoom and Teams. And what I mean by that is they might actually just do a ring around of people who are coming to their sessions before they come to them, just to get them warmed up, confident, get to know them, so that people then feel able to make the most of the sessions when they actually run them as well. So sometimes having some low-tech solutions in place alongside the digital services that you're offering can be something that really meets user needs, and that's where getting this kind of research and insight is so important. And then speaking of that point, that's great, Madeline, you're asking for regular feedback. That's the thing, I think we're going to see a real change in people's online habits during this time, and we're already starting to do that. So we need to make sure that we're continuing to look at these user needs pretty much continuously, I'd say, because we're going to all need to keep fine-tuning and iterating what we do as we go into the hopefully recovery phase of the pandemic. Adam's got a great point here about getting users directly involved in projects and activities, so that kind of co-creation obviously really, really important. And I think creating that feedback loop of, you told us about this, we've changed this, what do you think of this, is actually really, really great for helping people come on that journey with you and to encourage them to share more of their insights in the future as well. And Adam, you've made a great point here about how we can make sure we're getting that diversity of views too. So yeah, I think that's a really, really key one, isn't it? And thinking about how you can organise the research process so that as many people as possible from different backgrounds can get involved. And again, it might be really small things. So for example, we're just trying to do some user research with some young people, and we've talked about doing that with the charity who's involved, even into the evening, if that is a better fit for making sure we get as wide a spread of the young people we need to talk to as possible. Okay, lovely. So brilliant to see all of those. I wish we could spend almost the rest of the session on that, but we need to move on and dive into some of your questions. Just before we do that, I wanted to say that you will get this deck afterwards. What I have done is I have also put some supplementary information at the end of the deck about some more information from the report. So things like digital funding needs, I've included a few things on that, different stages of digital maturity that we use to slice and dice the data we get from the report, because that might be quite interesting for you guys and thinking about what stage you are at. So please do take a look at that extra information once you get the deck itself. So I'd love to hear your questions now. I think that they can be posted in the Q&A section, so we should be able to see them. Zoe, is that correct? Are people just going to pop them in the Q&A and then we'll be able to...
Yeah, so we've got a few already, but if anybody wants to post any more throughout the Q&A, feel free to do that. So I'll get started on the questions we've got so far. Thank you for that presentation, Zoe. It's very good. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. Okay, so the question here from Jenny says, it's a bit of a long one, but I'll read it all out. Our problem is the sheer overwhelming number of digital tools that are being used or need to be used, and we try very hard not to bombard them with change, but it's unavoidable with the needs that are arising. Do you have any suggestions on what can be done to help workforces and promote the need for digital skills without tiring them out and making them change averse?
It's a great question, Jenny, especially because I think generally speaking, as we saw from the burnout stats earlier, people are in quite an overwhelmed state right now anyway. And whilst it might be quite frustrating to the pace of change that we all want to see, I would be tempted to look at where you can dial things back a bit right now. So that might mean that you are looking to introduce 2 new digital tools over the next quarter rather than 5 new digital tools. So I think this really comes back to the user needs points that we talked about earlier. The more you can get a really full picture of what people want and what change is palatable to them at the moment, the more you can then really prioritize those tools. And it might also be a question of sitting down with your team and looking at all of those different tools and then perhaps putting them into a bit of an order of that this meets a really urgent business need, so we need to introduce this over the next 3 months. This thing can perhaps wait till after Christmas because it's a bit more of a nice to have. I think the more you can get it clear in your own mind of what's really important and urgent and what are the things that perhaps don't so much fit into those boxes right now, the easier it will be to make it manageable for staff and also to make it manageable for you guys in terms of implementing it as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good answer. Kind of categorizing the different kind of needs that you have as most important, kind of can wait, would be nice, kind of when you were at school and you had the grade you really wanted to get, but then the grade you'd be happy with, and then the grade you don't want to get, reaching for those targets. I think that's a really, really good answer. Question from David: creating a business case for digital transformation is an excellent idea, but how would I even start? Is there any guidance out there or examples?
Yes, there is some guidance out there, and in fact what I refer you to, David, a really good resource that I know a lot of charities have found really helpful is there was a blog that Megan Griffith-Gray, who used to work at NCVO, wrote a while ago about how you can create a really powerful business case for digital. And I think she used this this kind of structure because it was about a presentation she had to give to a board. And I know that's a question that came up in another of the Q&As that we've got here, which was about you know, taking people on a bit of a journey, helping people remember how far they'd come, but also really creating this need for where you needed to go next. So I'm very happy to share that, and perhaps I can send that over to you, Zoe, and then you can circulate it along with everything else. But what I would definitely recommend in making that business case, as well as having some really solid financials behind it, is also making sure that you tie it really closely to your organization's vision, mission, and strategy, which I know sounds very obvious, but what I sometimes see with business cases for new products and platforms is that people can get very bogged down and distracted by some of the shiny bells and whistles, and you want to keep your trustees and your leaders really focused on the impact of this investment as much as some of the financial detail that they'll need to have.
Yeah, and that resource that you mentioned, so we'll circulate it with the recording as well, and we'll also put it on the page after the webinar. So thanks for that. Next question from Pauline: is there a flowchart for people to map their way through this world?
I wish there was, Pauline. I could probably retire tomorrow then. Yeah, I've not come across. Let me see. What would you? Are you thinking in terms of specifically services, Pauline? Because I know you do a lot of work in that area, or more just general. Where am I at with digital maturity?
I'm just thinking to see if Pauline's expanded in the chat, but I from my understanding, I think she's referring to digital maturity, but I could be wrong. But I think that seems like the best interpretation.
So what I would do there is, I think, going back to some of those maturity frameworks like the NCVO, Digital Maturity Matrix, the Digital Code of Practice. I mean, there's a number of different tools out there that you can use. I'm slightly skeptical of things like flowcharts, applying that to a transformation process, because in my experience, it's very rarely a straight line. I'm sure we would all like it to be, but we all know that organizational change is a messy, difficult thing, and sometimes you'll be taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, and I worry that perhaps with a flowchart people might start to give themselves a hard time that they perhaps weren't making the progress that they would need to in the order that they feel that they should. So I would go back to the maturity matrices and start with those, and then I think you'll be able to map out a roadmap from using those tools which identify where you need to go next, which I guess is the crux of this question, isn't it? What do I need to do, even if I do these things in an order that isn't perfect?
Yeah, and Pauline did say she was referring to digital maturity, so
okay,
you answered the question perfectly there, Zoe. Next question is from Sally. Any advice on how to encourage colleagues to see digital as something which needs to be sustained and developed rather than a lockdown fix, which we no longer need?
This is a lovely question, Sally. I really like this, because I have to say, at the moment, I do feel like there's a bit of tension in the sector and in individual organisations between people who've really got a taste for innovation and digital and want to keep moving forward with it and building on that progress, and people who want this comfort blanket of the way things were before. And I have to say, I completely sympathise with both camps. What I think is a really good thing to do is to give people a sense of, again, this sort of burning platform behind it. So when people are saying, well, actually, we want to go back to just running face-to-face fundraising events, things like that, the more you can show them some evidence and data about how the world has moved on during this time, the better. So in that case, for example, if you're looking at how fundraising has changed, have a look at things like the Blue State Digital report. And I know there have been a few other reports which Charity Digital have actually featured quite a lot about how people's online giving habits and fundraising methods have changed during this time. So I think you've got to keep challenging those assumptions within your organisation. If people are saying, oh yes, we'll just go back to how we were doing this before, if you can say to them, look, I've got this evidence, this insight which shows that the world has changed and moved on, even if we wish it would go back to the way it was, then that position becomes a bit weaker, I think, if they're trying to argue the case for going back to the status quo. So perhaps it's worth doing a little bit of desk research and looking at what reports there are out there which can challenge those assumptions people have made.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, because obviously there's the skills report, but in regards to fundraising, there's also a good report by Enthused, I think, that they release quarterly, which the most recent one does support that donors still want to give digitally, so that's really good as well. But I think also, like, kind of remembering that even before COVID, a lot of charities probably did have digital projects in the pipeline that they wanted to kind of roll out, but it was a kind of like when we will situation. But just because maybe things were sped up from COVID, it doesn't necessarily mean those projects then should be reeled back in.
Absolutely. And if I can just add something else to that question, because I think the issue Sally's raised is such a critical one to the future of the sector, is again, I think this does come back to gathering some evidence about user needs. So if your trustees are saying, well, we want to go back to how things were before, but you can show them not only how people's digital consumption habits have changed more generally in reports, but also I have spoken to this group of our donors, our supporters, people who use our services, and their use of digital has changed during this time, and this is what they told us about it. Then that's a really compelling way to bring the story home and make the case for why you need to keep building on the digital progress you've made over the last 18 months. So I would look at doing that exercise, and it can be as simple as perhaps talking to 5-10 people maximum of people in your charities, group of supporters, and really gathering those stories and that evidence that I think will be really powerful and make this perhaps less abstract and more tangible to anyone in your organisation who's a bit skeptical that the digital train is going to keep on moving.
Yeah, I guess if you have the right evidence to back up your point and your argument, people can't really argue with that, can they? We've got a question from an anonymous attendee here. What kind of skills would be most useful in candidates when recruiting for employees/volunteers?
Oh, that's a really interesting one, because I think without knowing more about what this attendee's charity does and where you're at with digital skills, that's actually quite a hard one to answer. If that person wanted to email me, I'm really happy to share some further thoughts on that. And what I would say is to make sure that you're thinking about the soft skills as much as the technical skills. So the example that I think came up in quite a few comments earlier about, well, how do I grow digital skills on my trustee board? Quite often people try and solve that problem, understandably, by getting a trustee who's very skilled with digital onto the board. That is a great thing to do. But if that person perhaps isn't a natural or perhaps isn't so confident about sharing their skills and kind of almost coaching the rest of the board and being a bit of a champion for digital on the board, then digital is just going to stay with that one person at board level. So I think looking for people who are really good communicators as much as technical experts is something we all need to consider as we look to recruit, obviously depending on the different roles that there are. Yeah. I'm conscious of time.
I was just about to say we've just hit the 2 o'clock mark, so there is a couple of other questions in here, but if anybody wants those answered, because unfortunately we don't have time, am I allowed to say they can reach out to you, Zoe, or they can reach out to someone from Charity Digital? But thank you so much for this very engaging and insightful webinar, Zoe. It was lovely to have you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick note on things we've got coming up. So If you always keep an eye on the Charity Digital upcoming events tab, we've always got webinars, podcasts, and our next virtual event as well, Be More Digital Fundraising Day in October. We spoke a lot about skill building today, and that is definitely something we'll be focusing on at Fundraising Day. So do sign up if you're free. It's free. So yes, thank you so much, Zoe, and everyone for joining us. Please do fill in the feedback form as well. That should pop up when you leave the webinar. And I hope everyone has a lovely day. Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.